Hi everyone, hope you're doing good. In today's lesson, we are not going to learn any new content. We're instead going to focus on exam technique and thinking about how to answer an 18-mark question. Now, this is super important. Obviously, it's the question with the most marks in our exam, but it's also not just the People's Health course where this question comes up. We're going to have a very similar question in 4 out of 5 of our main GCSE components. So not just People's Health, but also a question like this will come up in looking at Nazi Germany, looking at America, and in the Norman Conquest. So over time, we'll continue practicing it and get to the level where we're absolutely smashing this kind of answer. And we start that today. So how do we answer an 18-mark question? Well, to start off, there are 3 kind of key things to keep in mind. Number 1, we need to try and be super clear about our arguments. This is the best GIF I can find for this, although it's not a great one. It's a bit aggressive. We are being tested here on our ability to make a clear argument. As we'll see in a moment, these 18-mark questions are basically posing a bit of a debate, and we have to give a clear argument about what we believe. Second major thing to always keep in mind with 18-mark questions is you have to show both sides of the argument. Like I said already, these questions are always about a kind of debate. Do I disagree or do I agree? To hit top marks, high marks, like we're all aiming for here, we're all going to achieve, we have to show we understand there are 2 sides to every argument. And thirdly, again, another thing we can just try and build in our minds, in our memories that we always think about with 18-mark questions is we're looking for 4 major points. Okay, not 3, 4. If we want to, if we have time, you could push on to 5. It's never going to be a bad thing. But in general, what we see from what the examiners tell us and looking at examples of students that have got full marks, you're basically looking for 4 major points. Now, all those 3 things will become clearer as we go through, but to quickly recap, we're looking for a clear argument, we're looking for 2 sides of the argument, and we're looking for 4 major points. Now, let's look at an example of a question. So this is the one we're going to focus on today. How far do you agree that living conditions in towns during the early modern period, that's the period we've just studied, 1500 to 1750, were no better than during the Middle Ages, another way of saying medieval times, 1250 to 1500. Just pause for a second, and I'll let you just read that question again by yourself. Okay, now, whenever we get a question like this, or any question in an exam paper, I would always recommend that you underline key parts of the question, just to make sure that you're focused on exactly what it's asking. These questions tend to always say, how far do you agree? It might be worded slightly differently, but basically it's giving you a statement and it's saying, do you agree or disagree, basically. So we're going to underline key parts. Now, first thing that crops up here is living conditions. Whenever we see that, we underline it and we just write a quick note to remind us, what are we talking about with living conditions? We're talking about food, water, housing, waste. I'd always suggest you write that on the exam paper. Just keeps your mind really focused on what you're going to write about. So how far do I agree that living conditions, meaning food, water, housing, waste? Then in towns, people often will rush into an answer like this and will start writing about living conditions in general, including in the countryside. No, this question is asking us about towns, so we're going to underline that to keep our mind super focused. We're going to underline or circle the time periods. We're going to have to compare these different times, early modern to Middle Ages, and then we just need to check exactly what the question is saying. So it's asking us whether living conditions were no better in 1500 to 1750 than they were in 1250 to 1500. So, how far do I agree that living conditions were no better? Now, remember I said we need to look at 2 sides of the argument. One thing that I'd always find helpful at this stage, and I would do myself, would be to think quickly, okay, so on the one hand, the side, one kind of side of the argument here is that things were no better. Now, what's the opposite? So what's the opposite argument? What's the other side? And I'm sure, as you are thinking, the other side of the argument is, well, living conditions in towns were better. Okay, so we've got our two different sides to the argument here. Living conditions in towns were no better, and living conditions in towns were better. Again, just a recommendation, but something I would urge you to do is before you start writing, it's really worth, even if you feel like you're in a bit of a rush and want to get going, it's always worth taking a minute, even 2 minutes. It will pay off later on to make a quick table of your major arguments. That will mean when you start writing, you don't get lost and lose your focus. So we're going to write a super quick table. To illustrate that, I've made it messy. So you can do this really quickly on the back of an exam paper or on the side of your sheet, wherever, it doesn't matter. Write a quick table. What are my major points for both sides of the argument? Now remember I said you're going to make 4 points. In general, what the examiners would urge, or rather would recommend, is you have 2 arguments for one side and you have 2 arguments for the other. Now, on some occasions, you might feel so strongly that you make it kind of 3-1. Okay, so you've got these 4 points. Normally, it'd be 2-2, 2 on one side, 2 on the other. It might be you have 3 on one side and 1 on the other. On a very, very rare occasion, I think there's been 1 or 2 questions in the whole time of this exam where the question might have been kind of controversial, I guess, and where you might have said, okay, actually, it's really clear to me. I'm going to make 4 key points to back up one side of the argument. But in general, and I would suggest we think about most questions along these lines, we're going to go for 2 points on either side. So at this stage, can you pause the video and can you just think of a couple of points for either side? What can you remember about living conditions in towns? What can you remember that would back up an argument to say things didn't improve? So that's the left-hand side. And what can you think of to back up the argument on the right-hand side, that actually things did improve? Things were better in 1500 to 1750 compared to 1250 to 1500. Pause the video. You can just think about these in your head. If you want to, you can write them down. And when you're ready, you can continue the video. Okay. Now, leave that. Here are 4 arguments that I have come up with, and maybe these are similar to what you have. I've tried to focus on food, housing, water, waste, and here are the points that I put for both sides. Can you pause the video and read through these points? Once you've read through them, you've thought about them, you've made sure you understand them, you can continue the video. Okay, make sure you've read through those. If you haven't, pause, take your time to read through the points. So we've got 2 points on the left-hand side, which argue that things weren't better. And then we've got 2 points on the right-hand side that say, actually, things were better, things did improve. Now, once we've got our 4 points, and these are obviously relatively detailed. When you make your quick table, they probably wouldn't be as detailed as this, but just wanted to put kind of a bit more information here for the sake of this video. So once you've made your quick table, you need to think, right, which side am I going to argue for? Which side do I agree with? What do I find most convincing? And for me, I'm going to go with this side. So I think those points are stronger than the points on the other side. I think overall, living conditions weren't better. Now, important to say at this point that there's no wrong or right answer for these questions. It's just about how strongly you make your argument. Obviously, your argument needs to be based on facts, but you can get top marks for arguing either side. Okay, it's just about how you argue it and what examples and points you use to make. But in this question, I'm going to say, right, I'm probably going to go on the left-hand side. I'm probably going to argue that things were no better. And then I need to think about, okay, well, I've got my points for that. To really argue that strongly, convincingly, I need to show that the other side is wrong. So I'm going to give the points for the other side, points 3 and 4, but then I'm going to have to think about how can I say, well, you're wrong. What's my argument for showing that this side is wrong? Well, I'm probably going to focus on these 2 points. These improvements are only really for the rich. Take the top one, some improvements in access to clean water, more conduits, some houses had clean water piped in. We know that these were basically only for the rich. And so for me, that's one of my main arguments to show that this side of the argument isn't that valid. But also I might say, even some developments didn't really improve things. So imported food included sugar, for example, which was bad for people's health. So we're always trying to obviously back up our argument on the left-hand side there, and also we're trying to kind of show why the other side is wrong. So we've made our table, we've got our 4 points, 2 on one side, 2 on the other. If you've got another major points to back up your own, like I've put a 5 there, you might have an extra point, but like I said before, you can focus just on 4 major points to start off with. And then we come to writing it. So how do we structure our 18-mark answers? Well, I'd suggest we do it in 4 sections. We've got our introduction, section 1, section 2, and conclusion. Let's quickly talk through these, and then you're going to have a go in a moment. So, introduction. Here we need to give our argument. So we're going to say, how far do I agree with this statement? Always try and use words from the question and give a quick introduction to your argument. You don't want to go into lots of detail here, but you're giving a quick overview of what you believe. Okay? This tells the examiner what you think, and it also guides you throughout your answer to make sure you're backing it up. So here's a quick example. Living conditions in towns did see some developments between the Middle Ages and the early modern period. However, for the major things that impacted people's health, such as housing and waste, nothing significant improved. As towns grew bigger, some things even got worse in terms of living conditions. And I therefore agree with this statement. So we're giving an introduction to our argument, but we're making clear what we believe. Okay, so I've said there at the end of my introduction, I therefore agree with this statement. Okay, we then move on to section 1. And section 1 is our clear points about what we believe. 2 major points to back up our argument. These can be in 1 paragraph or they can be in 2. We need to try and use as many keywords as possible, and we also need to try and keep referring back to the question. For example, we might keep on saying, this shows that living conditions were no better. Okay, keep on referring back to that question. We also need to always make sure we're comparing both time periods. So you need to keep on mentioning what something was like in medieval Britain compared to what it was like in early modern Britain. That's our section 1. Section 2, we're going to give the other side to the argument. We could start off like this, for example. On the other hand, it could be argued that living conditions did improve in the early modern period compared to the Middle Ages because. And then we're going to give 2 or maybe 1 main points that the other side would say. Now, to pick up those top marks, to really push up high, we're going to have to try and say why they're wrong. Okay, so you can try and expose those arguments. Then we come to our conclusion. Key thing, no new information should be in your conclusion. You shouldn't be making any new points. Instead, you want to reiterate your major points. So you give a clear point of view and you give your main, what could be described as a kind of knockout argument. Okay, this is how it's been described by examiners. You give your 1 major point. Okay, instead of a picture of someone punching someone else as a knockout, let's use this picture, like a kind of a slam dunk argument. What's your major point where anyone reads it and thinks, yeah, that person's right. You can't really argue with that. Okay, so you can your major point about why you agree or disagree with the statement. Okay, so that's a quick introduction to these types of questions. You might want to go back and rewatch parts of that video. And all these points and all these things will become clearer and clearer, and you'll get more and more confident with them as we go through the course and keep on practicing these questions. If you need any help throughout today's lesson, please get in touch. I look forward to seeing your work, everyone. Well done for working hard, keep it going, and I look forward to seeing you later on this week. Okay, take care, everyone. Bye-bye.